Welcome to the Pure Property Podcast. Whether you are considering buying your first investment property or reaching property mogul status, we dissect the fundamentals through to large-scale property development and everything in between.
G'day everyone, how you going? Welcome to the Pure Property Podcast with Paul Glossop. Lots of P's there. My name's Phil Tarrant. I'm co-host of the podcast. Brand new series for smart property investment across the Property Investment Podcast Network. This channel has been building up over many years, and it's my great pleasure to announce the launch of a new show on the Property Investment Podcast Network, the Pure Property Podcast with Paul Glossop. I do like a P, it's what my first name starts with, and obviously the host, the co-host, the brains trust, the talent of this particular podcast is Paul Glossop. Paul Glossop, how are you going?
I'm extremely excited, Phil. It's been a very long time coming. I reckon, mate, we've been musing across podcasts since podcasts pretty much became a thing. And it's probably been, I reckon, comfortably 6, 7, maybe 8 years in the making. And we're finally here. And
so your very own podcast?
Very own podcast. I'm excited.
Are you important enough to have your own podcast?
Well, I didn't think I was for that 6, 7 or 8 years, evidently. Okay. But here we are.
All right. So you got your own podcast. It's good. I do remember, it's got to be 6 years ago.
Yep.
But by way of, I guess, a backstory, I remember when you said, I'm going to start my own podcast. I went, oh, okay, sure. That sounds like a great idea, Paul. Like, seeing that the Smart Property Investment Show has been going for a long time and it's very successful. And I went, yeah, sure. And he went, look, I'm looking for some talent. And I went, okay. And then you told me that you couldn't find anyone, but you asked if I was happy to appear on your podcast. And I remember sitting in a like a granny flat somewhere. I can't remember where it was. I remember the roof had a raked ceiling, and it was a podcast when you were trying to kick off your own podcast. I think you did 2 episodes of it. You never launched it, right?
Yeah, it kind of got too hard basket. It was a little bit pre sort of Fiverr and the like, where you could basically record quickly, get it to get the audio sliced and diced. It was one of those things where I kind of looked at it was very daunting to think, how would I slice, dice, and then promote this? Probably in retrospect should have done it anyway. I think the juice was worth the squeeze. But I think more to your point is that you certainly weren't the first person I went to.
No. And now you come knocking on the door saying, oh,
full circle.
Cap out. Can I be part of the Property Investment Podcast Network? The biggest in Australia. Listened to around the world as well, I'm told.
The irony. It actually is the biggest in Australia.
And I went, sure. But it's got to be different, I said. It's got to be different. So you've been really imaginative with the name of it, the Pure Property Podcast with Paul Glossop. The name of your business is what?
Well, I wanted to make sure that people actually knew what the podcast was about. I didn't want to make it abstract and something a little bit flighty. I thought, well, at least the title, will people know what they're actually dialing in for.
So it's purely about property.
There'll be a bit of BS in between you and I, no doubt, which is unfortunately unavoidable.
Right,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. I knew what I was in for there. But look, I think we've probably been collectively sitting across this desk for long enough to know that we've got some pretty interesting things to tell. But I think to your point, it's got to be different because we do talk a lot about property.
There's a lot of podcasts out there around property. Yep. You know, and I tune in a lot. There's some good ones around there as well. You know, I think of some and it's essentially been around for maybe slightly longer than the Smart Property Investment Show is the Property Couch. Really good.
I've actually been on that with them.
You have
with Ben and Bryce before.
Good operators, those guys.
Absolutely.
And so there is some very good podcasts around there. So the thing is, okay, if we're going to do this, let's do it properly. Let's do something differently. But I want to be the first to give you a hard time about that. I don't know what you call that, avatar. The avatar on the screen I can see right now.
You can talk to your team about that. I said, well, instead of just using an image of me, let's turn it into some sort of cartoon, and that was the best option. Would you believe it?
It actually looks like you're wearing an expensive suit for once.
I don't know if it's expensive, but it was a suit jacket.
It does. It looks like they've zhuzhed it up with a bit of
businesses at the top, party at the bottom.
They've gone from Lowe's to Armani with a couple of clicks of the what do you call InDesign files. But for those of you who are tuning in on video, you'll see what we're talking about here. So it's my privilege to be able to be the first to give you a hard time about that. Mate, they got your eye colour wrong. You don't have the aqua.
Agua?
Aqua. I don't know. I'm gonna wake up in the middle of the night, sort of shaking. look at it. So is that what different is? That's how it's going to be different.
No.
Let's not use a real photo.
But I think
Let's
that's hopefully a little
avatar.
indication as to say, hey, it's going to be a little bit different.
You're going to push it out. You're going to be edgy.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, we're typically pretty edgy, you and I, on this, and I think people will know that when we do get behind the microphone, we're not going to be talking about theories and relativity and all the other things which are very abstract.
We can't do that because we're not particularly smart people.
No, correct. Yeah. So that's why I do like to talk fact, because I can't make it up.
Yeah, this is it. So it's got to be different. How's it going to be different? So a lot of people, if you've been tuning in, or if you've been familiar with, or liking or following the Property Investment Podcast Network for a while, you would have seen Paul appear semi-frequently. We get on, have a yarn about property, what's going on. And your stuff rates pretty well. People like
pretty well. Yeah,
rates pretty well. Not the best, which I know would worry, but probably therein sort of gives our opportunity to show how this will be different. And we've sort of been thinking in the background, okay, how do we do it? You know what? Just another property podcast talking about property and the fundamentals. Everyone talks about the fundamentals. I'm a big. It's got to be enjoyable. It's got to be a bit of infotainment. It's got to be factual. Number one. Number two, it's got to be useful. Number three, it needs to be actionable. And number four, it should be really repeatable. And in many ways, that's how a really good portfolio is constructed. But I thought the best way to do it, and maybe in my youth, and I know in your youth, we were reasonable sports people. How do we get some sense for structure with this? And we've spoken about it before on this. On the Smart Property Investment Show, where we sort of start using sometimes, some sports analogy, and that's not like rah type stuff. It's about the mechanical structure of being a good sports person. Often plays into the mechanical structure of doing anything effectively. Training, discipline, all these type of things. And your book, which I think is about to get its second iteration, A Surfer's Guide to Property Investment, which is property investing, which has been around for that's got to be
2019.
Is that how long it's been?
Yep. Yeah, 4 years now.
I remember going out and celebrating the launch of that. I've got a photo on my phone.
Do you?
Yeah, out the back of.
I have to get you to share that.
Where were we? It was you, a guy called Jeff, another guy called Uwe, and they might tune into this.
I think it was in Balmain.
Yeah, no, it was in the Rocks. They've got this great story of a great picture of a sunset. I remember out the side of the Captain Cook Hotel, where it was sort of a few beers in, and then I think we went to the. That German Bavarian beer cafe and ate a massive
pork knuckle and all the rest of it.
Pork knuckle and a big thing of schnitzel and stuff. But so that's your book. So the next installment's coming out. I want to get the book out of the way.
So the next installment is coming out. It's probably be very early 2024. I assume it'll hit the Dimics of the world and essentially do ebooks and all the rest of it. But I think so what we're going to be doing is taking what we've learned over the last 5 years since I first wrote that book and putting the advancement of, hey, look, we can talk about property now with also a pandemic thrown in there and walk through some lessons, learnings. And not only that, but, I've personally as an investor, and I'm certainly an active investor, which we'll discuss, I've evolved what I do and how I do it. And we've certainly worked with thousands of clients in pure property investment to talk about how they've evolved as investors as well, and that's a big part of what we're going to be discussing.
Do you look at that now and you ever go, it's a bit cringy what I wrote there, or
a little bit, But
how much has changed? Do you think?
The factual parts of it, because a lot of that's sort of a walk through history lane. So the book itself, and people can still get a copy of this on Pure Property Investment if they wanted to get their own copy.
I thought it was sold out and it's back orders.
Well, we can always get more. They can print more. That's the beauty about books is they can print more. We've got the manifest, the original, but. Some of it's interesting though because I read over what my position looked like, and I did divulge a bit about where I was, where I got to, and at the point of time it was sort of the end of 2018, start of 2019, which is obviously a line in the sand, and I can't discuss more in the book because it was printed. And I look at where I was, and I also look at some valuations of things that I've talked about. One in which was my home that I grew up in, which is actually since sold as of only 12 months ago. This is the irony of it. I remember I looked through that and there's a whole chapter about where I grew up, what my mum and dad paid for that property of $30,000 in 1980. at the time of 2018 when I put the data in, that house was worth about $850,000. Western suburbs of Sydney, $850,000 that property was worth at that time. My mum sold that house last year and essentially has moved into a smaller property to suit for $1.1 million. This is sort of more goes back to saying, there's a whole bunch of really interesting things, even just looking at the data from only 4-5 years ago, and how it evolves and how it extends over time.
Well, and this is the point. I think some people may know your backstory, but I thought it'd be a good chance for maybe people who are new to this platform, the Property Investment Podcast Network, who might not know about you and haven't yet read the book, to maybe have a look at that. Because if we're going to go about talking about property, talking about the theory and practice of property and how to do it effectively, it's good to know who's actually on the other side there talking about it. And there's a lot of buyers agents out there. I'd say you've been at it longer than most. There's some who have been at it a lot longer than you have.
Mm-hmm.
But you are an active property investor. I'd probably argue you're probably a property investor first and a buyer's agent second.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've probably become more that way in the last 5 years, personally. Yeah. And I'm happy to share. I mean, I guess for those who are just listening the first time and maybe have not necessarily got too much of my own backstory, I guess personally, my position started from a property standpoint a very long time ago. And I actually do write a bit about this in my first book here, is that my first love in the property space was not necessarily investing. I definitely enjoyed the concept of design and the concept of property development. I spent a couple of years post high school trying to go down that pathway, and there's actually you speak about certain parts of what I read through. There's a certain part in the first chapter here which is called a U-turn at a pub. Right here,
it's where most U-turns happen.
Yeah. And it wasn't actually involving many more beers than 1.5, ironically, but it was after my full 2 semesters body of work, which back in the day was on a laptop, and I guess I was studying architectural drafting at the time, and you designed part of the year 2, you design everyone designs the same 4-story office building, and essentially you have to go through learning the software, learning all the Australian standards and on design, thickness of slabs, a whole raft of different things. You design it, you put it on your computer, and then you actually take the USB, put it in, take that out, and then give it to your professor, and then ideally they mark it. Now, I had my computer, hadn't done the USB transfer at the time, and this was 20 years ago, mind you, probably about 20 years ago. So, cloud technology wasn't a thing. I was at the Broadway Hotel, just opposite UTS. A couple of different
it's getting renovated, that Broadway.
There's all that area is very fancy these days.
Yeah.
And anyway, laptop bag below our feet, just sitting around a table, was going to be a beer to celebrate us finishing that large piece of work, which is basically what we did for 6 months. And I went off to the toilet, came back, looked down, laptop bag didn't exist anymore. I thought a couple of my buddies may be playing tricks on me, but after a couple of don't joke around anymore conversations, realised that someone had come and nicked my bag, went through the CCTV and realised that someone picked it up, ran straight out the door, never saw that again. That kind of led to me then having a conversation with my professor, and they said, unfortunately, we've got nothing to mark, so therefore we can't provide you with marks. So my option was to go and have to resit and redesign and redo everything for 6 months. And I took that as an opportunity to pivot in my life, which led to basically me going surfing for 6 months at the time, not doing a heck of a lot, having a part-time job, saving a bit of money, and then I redeployed my time into education and became a teacher for a very short period of time. And one thing that probably happened during that time is that I realised that my interest in property evolved a lot into different things, which was how to make money in property, how to use property as an investment vehicle, and a range of different things. So long story short, there was an interest early, which pivoted to something else, which ended up being a very early career, which since changed. But that really is what, I guess, the part of property really started my interest in property itself, property development, property investing. And then from that point, very mid-20s-ish is when I really put my foot in the door and bought literally the first property, which went on to be one of hundreds one of thousands for clients, and one of quite a number of different assets, investments, buy and holds, etc. for myself and my wife.
So I hope you now have a mantra in life of always have a backup.
Yes.
That's probably a tough lesson.
Very tough lesson. It wasn't an easy one. It sounds very flippant at the time, but as anyone who sits there and probably has been through not necessarily something similar as in getting your laptop stolen, but knows what goes into
sounds
those
fishy.
parts.
Sounds like you're taking a creative license there. You know? Sounds fishy. What describe the person that nicked the laptop?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. You could go ask the Broadway Hotel about it. They'd probably have something saved back in the day. I did lodge a police file, so there would be a record on file somewhere, I would assume.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I might get my people to look this up.
Put it this way: I didn't ask for credits. Yeah. I didn't get a pass.
No doubt, the professor, whoever it was, knew you'd been working on it and had seen versions of it.
Yeah, there absolutely is. But I guess what I'm getting at here is that I think I realised that architecture itself
was it for you?
It was probably an opportunity for me to explore
and
other
this
things.
Is what the
but I was actually really good
before.
at it, which was the only. I just didn't like the theory part of it because there was a lot of history involved and a lot of other things, which wasn't my cup
I've
of tea.
nicked this saying off one of the great men of real estate, Tom Panos.
Yep.
Some of the best gifts come badly wrapped.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what you're talking
Tom
about there.
say that a number of times. Yeah,
he loves it. But there you go. Some of the best kids can badly wrap.
Absolutely.
You could be working in an architectural firm right now, 80 hours a week.
And that's
designing other
and
people's
I work with
houses.
a lot of architects right now, ironically, and most of them don't love what they do. Yeah. It's a tough gig.
People like the idea of it. It's quite creative, but you know,
it's also quite restrictive at the same time.
It is very restrictive.
Yeah.
It is so always have backup.
Yeah.
Correct.
Correct.
I've always got about 10 backups.
Yeah.
You know me pretty well. But to the point around how do we make this podcast different? So I want to give you all a bit of a sense to Paul's background and how now on this show we can look to extract some of that information to help you make better buying decisions as you are and if you are and as you continue to invest in property. But I sort of spoke about this idea of a bit of a sporting, structure to this, and a lot of people yawn, sport. That's pretty much how I see the world as well. But I get it. I get the discipline, and I get the structure. I get the attitude, the aptitude, the mindsets, everything that makes great sports people. And Australia's just gone berserk over the Matildas here in Australia, and it gives you again some sense to how much Australians do like sport. It's sport just isn't turning up on the day and playing a good game of cricket or footy or netball or soccer or whatever it is. There is everything that's wrapped up in and around it, and particularly for professional sports people. So we thought the best way for us to try and give some sense to architecture of this podcast, because I know Paul does like a bit of architecture, some structure to it, is to approach most things with a notion of the pre-game work, the game and the post-game. And I remember having a chat with Paul when we're sort of, iterating the ideas of this podcast. And my point was the post-game is probably one of the most important parts of any type of endeavour. A sports or business or personal relationships or anything, your ability to debrief after something is really going to set you up well to go into anything new moving forward. So the way we're going to structure this podcast, and you'll see it develop over the coming 12 months, we'll be sort of getting together once a month for 12 months on this special series, is that we'll talk about particular theories or ideas or strategies, in principle discussions around how stuff works. But then importantly, we're actually going to speak to real people, and Paul will host those conversations, speak to real people who are doing it. And then what myself and Paul would be doing is using our skills and capabilities to look at the wash up, the wrap up, looking at what happened, how things can be done better, what would have been a more effective way to approach things, what was good, what was bad, what was indifferent. And again, that's very much of a sort of sporting mindset of, everyone watches the shows on TV about people talking about what happened in a game of sport.
Yep.
And in many ways, I know teams do it. I know you still do it, the sport that you play, where you get around and talk about what just happened. How do we get better?
Yeah.
And very much that lends itself to property. And I know you talk very similarly in the book. The new book is coming out in
probably January 2024.
So have you written it, or it's writing
we're
now?
probably halfway through.
Yep.
Yeah.
Enjoying the process?
It's slow. But it's probably easier to do because I've got a basis for the first time around. First time around was 18 months. It's partly rework, partly new work. Yeah. But it's going to be completely new, put it that way.
Okay. So you got your own podcast now.
Yep.
Sounds like it's going to be pretty interesting.
I reckon so.
You've chosen really probably the best person in Australia to be able to host it with you. That's probably the smartest thing you've done.
So you're about to enter the room.
About to enter the room. Yeah.
Is that
I'm just warming up the mic.
John Laws?
I'm just the. What's? Yeah, I'm not going to go there. So we can get stuck into it. So I'm going to have to. Are you going to update the backstory bit on your book?
I might have to.
Yeah,
but I might have to get someone else to write that.
You might need to.
Yeah.
But where was your first property, Paul?
If I look at the starting point, this is dusting off the memory banks a little bit here. First purchase was a 2-bedroom unit, red brick, block of 18, 3 blocks from the beach in Cronulla, so southern Sydney.
Is that your first property?
That was my first purchase.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was bought as an owner-occ at the time. Never intended for it to be a long-term owner-occ, but essentially scraped together deposit using first home buyers grant that was available for established property at the time. I think we had less than 10 grand as a deposit. No, let me correct that. This is why it's getting a bit dusty. Less than 20 grand as a deposit, but it was 5% deposit, or a bit less than 5% deposit, no lender's mortgage insurance, no stamp duty, I think was the incentive, and maybe 7 grand first home buyers grant.
Heavy incentives.
Oh, well, yeah, you look at that right now. I mean, the stamp duty alone is, what's that? I think purchase price was $382,000. And you can see here that's live. That's using a lot of my brain power to remember that one. But yeah, we had essentially, call it the same, we had about a $360,000 debt on that property. Interest rates at the time were about what they are right now, which was about 5 to 6%, maybe a bit above. I think it might have been 7-ish percent.
And people go crazy about it, saying, "Oh, it's so high, it's normal."
So I've seen it. I have seen it before.
They're just much bigger. The numbers of what stuff costs these days, right?
Or alternatively, it's just relative, right? Like people just haven't seen those numbers, so they think, "Oh, how do we afford this?" It's bedlam. They've been there before. They'll be there again. Yeah.
Do you still own that property?
It's a property that I don't own now. Yeah. And it's for a reason that property was harvested from an equity standpoint 2 times to push me into other assets. And it only was sold when I actually moved out of that property probably about 18, 24 months after buying it, renovating it, getting it revalued, extracting equity, and that was used to buy other assets. But beyond that, there was the ability to either hold it, turn it into an investment, which, look, it's certainly worth more now than what it was when I sold it. But we used that because we basically tapped out from a serviceability to buy our next principal place of residence, which was a 3-bedroom apartment about 3 blocks further away, which I still own that property to this day.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you milked it for heaps of equity and you sold it, replaced the principal place of residence, but you were able to use that as a juncture to buy or start buying investment properties.
Yeah.
So where was your sort of first investment?
I think the first investment was a house in Campbelltown from memory. So Campbelltown, Western Sydney. For anyone who is familiar with that area, they'll know exactly what it was. This was probably 15 years ago now. About a bit less than 15 years ago, maybe 13, 14 years ago, that property was bought. But at that time, I think we paid $252,000 for that house. 13, 14 years ago, corner block, 580 odd square metre property. I still own that property to this day. 3-bed clad house, built a granny flat on that property about 2 years after, knowing that we had no intention of selling that property. Probably spent about $90,000 in total giving it an uplift and a granny flat. That property today is worth about $850,000 and has no debt on it and has an income of about $900 a week on that particular property. And again, that property propelled us to other properties. And I think the separate property we bought with that equity from the original Cronulla asset, again, about 13 maybe odd years ago, was I believe it was a 2-bedroom villa in Mount Druitt at the time. Paid $182,000 for that property. Yeah. Put about 10 grand into it. Also sent one of my buddies into the emergency room with some mystery infection from helping me out with the renovation, which I'm pretty sure there's unfortunately a bit of par for the course when you're going down the pathway of doing your own DIY stuff. And I still owe him a beer for the help that he put in there. That property I don't own anymore, but again, that property at its peak was worth about $400,000. I think I sold it just a bit below that last year. last year. And again, it was a property that served a big purpose in my portfolio, but just as a property that I didn't need anymore. So taking the cash off the table to use that for other things, because it essentially would have been an impediment from a serviceability standpoint. So there were two properties that first property allowed me to do within about an 18-month time frame.
Yeah, and I know sort of, as you've accelerated down your property pathway, you've gone into doing a lot of developments, and a big part of this podcast will be, it says it in the introduction there, it's really dissecting, these the fundamentals of properties, but all the way from, buying sort of mum and dad inverted commas properties that you're talking about now through to, extrapolating out into development and being a lot more proactive in your wealth creation through property. So tell me what happened after that Mount Druitt property.
So, and I know we've talked about this over the years, and you probably forget a lot of these things, to be honest with you, but I know, like, one thing I've always done is stayed active, and I've never sort of bought and say, what, for the next 10 years, I'm just going to let it do its thing. I'm still doing this to this day, and never let anything just do its thing. I'm constantly tinkering, constantly looking. And I believe that back in, might have been 2011, 2012, the Campbelltown property, Mount Druitt property, freshened both up, revaled, equity out. I believe I bought a duplex both sides down South Shell Harbour region. I think at the time I might have paid $370,000 for a pair of duplexes down there. I think that property at this time is now worth probably close to $800,000 or $900,000, renting for about $900 a week now, and that's had very little done other than the standard basic repairs, maintenance, paint, carpet blinds a couple of times over, hot water heaters when they come up, 10, 12 years in the hold. And then I think I also bought a property, which I think I remember telling you about in the Hunter Valley in Muswellbrook at the time.
Okay, Muswellbrook.
That was a tough one.
Yeah.
That was a lesson. That was a sight unseen, bought at auction, paid not much, $250,000 for it, but that took about $80,000 of additional equity, which I extracted from other assets. The intention with that one was to buy it, renovate it, either get it rented at a much higher price or sell it at a profit.
Yeah.
Neither of those two things was achieved from that property. I probably end up breaking even on it after 6 or 7 years of holding it. Yield was fine. Once the tenants were in there, probably was neutrally geared, but the opportunity cost of $80,000 over a 6-year period on that property probably lost me, if I'm honest, probably lost me $500,000 to $800,000 in future earnings, because of probably me wanting to make faster money out of that asset and try to roll the dice a bit. And that was a big lesson, very, very big lesson for me moving forward with a lot of other investments. And not only that, shapes a lot more of, I guess, more of the strategy and reality of property investing long term as well.
Yeah, and it's, again, one of the outcomes of this podcast is to draw on those lessons, not only your own, but those that you've seen working with hundreds, I would imagine, of clients who've probably come to you with, everyone's got some scar tissue like that type of thing.
Absolutely.
And I imagine people are trying to recalibrate or ameliorate a portfolio which isn't performing very well. And, yes, you say you broke even on that, but it's the missed opportunity where
Correct.
I think most property investors, and I've got many stories like that personally.
We've talked a lot about that over the years.
Yeah,
for sure.
because there's so many missed opportunity stuff. But you know what, it's okay.
But without that, there's no lesson. So and I think that's the big part, and that's shaped. We're talking. This is still way back around 2012, 2013. To be honest with you, probably had a portfolio of a couple of $1 million back then. It was neutrally geared, and I thought I was doing all right, which I was. I was busy, I was active, I wasn't unhappy, but I think I learned a lot from that. Which that portfolio from there allowed me to realise that at the time, probably the exposure in Sydney for what I could afford to hold on a corporate salary at the time was probably going to extend itself to being redlined if I continue to buy those types of assets. And that's when I, at that time, ventured into southeast Queensland, and probably over an 18-month period, I think I might have bought, my wife and I probably at the time, bought maybe 4 or 5 separate assets, a little bit in the north of Brisbane, a little bit in the west of Brisbane. 2 of those assets I've since sold, which were low-rise villas. They did fine. They didn't do amazingly. Lesson learned out of those 2 is established freestanding houses will certainly, in the same market at the same time, over the time, there's another big lesson there that I found, irrespective of the market, has performed better as a percentage of growth, has performed better as a percentage of yield, as well as outgoings as well. I could have afforded to probably combine 2 of those villas and bought 1 house instead. And it was probably more of a, not necessarily a numbers game, but wanting to get a bit of a spread. But the house, out of those 4 houses that I bought during that sort of 2-year period into the southeast Queensland market, I own all of those still today. I've subdivided 1, turned that into 2, had that retitled, 2 Torrens titled houses on a corner block, another property. You've had another granny flat built, renovated a couple of those houses in the time, not necessarily huge renovations, but just to get them prepped and ready for a 10, 15-year hold. And to be fair, what was probably about $1.3, $1.4 million in total spend at that time, and they were still modestly priced properties in middle ring / growth areas. Those properties have doubled in value and will consistently perform quite well from a yield perspective. So that probably allowed me by the end of 2014-15 had a really good mix of assets in a range of different markets. And at that time, we're talking 2014-15, that was when I personally sort of built a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of knowledge over a 5-6 year period there, which came back to my story as to where I started and why. Really rekindled my passion to say, I love this. This is what I do. This is what I know I'm really good at. I'm knowledgeable in it. I'm very well versed at how to execute correctly. I've learned some lessons as the things I probably wouldn't do. And that led to helping friends and family before I started pure property investment, sort of 2014 odd. And we started our business in 2015. So basically 8 years, close to 10 years now, and quit my corporate job at the time, had a lot of debt, had a young son, and had all the risk that we could take. And, Phil, I know your backstory is not dissimilar, mate. Like these good things can only happen by taking some risk, but the risk was calculated because I knew in my mind that I knew what I was doing. I knew the propensity as to where this could go. And it was very early stages of the buyer's agency space too, is that there was only a handful of others who were doing it. But it was exciting, mate. And since then, we've helped 2,000 investors get to various outcomes, and most of them are very, very well versed in where to do it. And
hopefully we get to chat to some of them as part of this podcast. And it sounds like you've built a professional U-turn into property, but you've built it on the adage of you might not have liked the lesson, but that was a good lesson. Yeah, and it's only through having those lessons, even though they're painful sometimes and you'd rather not have them, that gives you the capability to go out there and change your thought process, your thinking. It gives you, a set of skills to now support other people as a buyer's. Are you a buyer's agent? What do you call yourself?
Absolutely, I'm a buyer's agent. 100%. That's what I sit on the board of the Property Professionals of Australia as a buyer's agent, as a licensed registered buyer's agent, and also as the owner of a buyer's agency. My role in that is to essentially guide and strategize our clients into where and what to buy and what to avoid, and ideally do it enough times to allow them to get to the point financially that they're a lot more comfortable than what they would have been the first time they spoke to us. Yeah.
So do you remember your first client, like first paid client?
I do, actually. Yeah. He's actually been on your podcast, and he'll be okay with me name dropping here, but he is actually an ex-Australian cricketer. Stephen O'Keefe was, I believe, was actually my first paid client, and I knew Steve through uni days. Funnily enough. I went through uni.
Sportsman.
We were fellow sportsmen.
You're a better spinner than him by memory, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and he'd be happy to vouch for that, no doubt. I was a left armer, though, so I think I'm pretty sure he was. No, I think he
was a lefty.
I think soccer's a left arm offie. Yeah, he's a left arm offie. So he's not bowling the leggies. No, he's bowling the offies, but. He's still kicking around in the Sydney Sixers, I believe, Steve. I think he's got a contract for this year, so I'm sure he's going to get out there and
buy some more property.
He still is actively. I spoke to Steve a couple of days ago and bought multiple properties, sold properties. There's a classic example of a client. I think we bought 3 or 4 properties for Steve in a couple of year period of time. Since then, I know Steve's portfolio has gone off to do wild and wonderful things. He's developing property, he's holding assets, and that's probably going to be a career for him after cricket, which he's evolving into now as well. But again, just sharing interest in things which not only are there to make money for yourself, but that was certainly one that I remember. So that evolved into essentially other people and spreading the good word of what we do, how we do it, how we support. And our business has certainly evolved to be very, very sophisticated in our processes, our systems, how we talk to our clients, how we research our markets, how we inspect our properties, how we present offers, how we do our due diligence, and probably more importantly than anything, how we do the wash up. How do we reassess where to next, what to do, making sure that we work with our clients. Typically every 6 to 12 months we speak with the same client, go through the same strategy. And it probably brings me to something, and we'll talk more about my portfolio in a second and where it's gone since then, Phil. But I know you mentioned the sporting analogies. One of my footy coaches way back when, and it still sticks with me to this day, and it's probably some advice that I probably didn't adhere to too well or well enough in my sporting career days. And I try to talk to my son and my daughter a lot about it too, but property itself is probably the best example of this. And this is business or sport or whatever. But it's as simple as ordinary things done for extraordinary periods of time create amazing outcomes.
Yeah.
It's no more complicated than that. And I don't care what you do in life. If you can do the basics really well and don't get bored and saying, when I go to training next, or when I buy the next property, or when I'm going to launch a business, or where I want to get that promotion, what I do what I do really well, and I don't get bored doing it, because I know that the true outcome is going to come by me being patient and me essentially just saying, stick to that F word, the fundamentals of just doing this the best I possibly can. And most people don't have exceptional skills. Most people don't have some data that you don't have. They just have the patience and the tenacity and the ability to just stick with it. And you know that.
And that's the secret, right? And most people, you could generalise, just want a shortcut to greatness and richness these days, right? What's the hacks? No, I don't want to know about the hard work. I want the
Musselbrook
hack.
is an example for me.
I want the hack. Just give me the hacks. Give me the shortcuts. And it doesn't exist in anything. I'll probably butcher this, but I think it's called the law of 100 or something or other, which is like if you do one thing every day for, I can't remember, the 12 minutes or something, call it whatever, you'll end up being better than 90% of the people in the world at that particular thing, right? But it's the routine and the repetition, going back to sports people, the routine and the repetition. It's the pre-game stuff that makes you exceptional on game day.
Yep.
And it's what you do after the game that gets you back into being exceptional, getting ready for game day the next day. Most people don't want to do the hard work, the hard graft. And you got to do that, you know. I call it strategic patience. You just got to sit there and just do. And a lot of people are going, well, you always got to be connected with the goal and the purpose and all that. That's all fine.
Yep.
But that's not enough. Yep. You know, you've got to just be able to do it and keep doing it, and don't think too much about doing it. Just do it. And then if you do it, eventually something will happen as a result.
And don't stop doing it.
Don't stop doing it.
And it goes back down to those two regrets that most property investors, and we've spoken to so many of them, we cared not to count anymore, but I should have started sooner and I shouldn't have sold when I did.
Yeah.
It's not much more complicated than that. And, you know, for me, that's really what it's always going to come back down to. It's no more complicated than that. And unfortunately, to your point, is that we're not going to give away secrets here that people can't necessarily take and do something with.
To your point around calculated risks in property, right? It's not a bad place. It's probably a safer place to take calculated risk, because you're going to get a softer landing. If you get it really, really wrong, you're probably going to bugger yourself and stuff yourself up for some time. But if you get it wrong, and you're talking about this Musselbrook property, you know, the outcome is, well, it means I could have been more effective if I didn't do that.
Yep.
You know, you got to get it pretty wrong in property to actually get it really, really wrong. Like, you know, it is forgiving unless you're an idiot. You know,
it's extremely forgiving, and it's probably the most forgiving asset class that you can invest in. Full stop. And it actually leads me to, and I know we talk a little bit about the analogies, etc. But this is another really good one that I've always adhered to or heard a lot of. And you speak to anyone to summarize how people get wealthy through property. Typically, the same algorithm or the same mantra is that you get wealthy through property slowly, then suddenly. And the suddenly part happens because you've done it so slowly for so long, then all of a sudden what was 100% compounding over a 15-year period of time became 100% compounding on that compounding 15 years prior, and all of a sudden your $100,000 deposit into your first $500,000 property created a $3 million asset base, and you've done nothing more than just sit around and manage your cash flow. And I've got, I mean, that was the other thing that I really probably thought, okay, well, what's a comparable? What could you otherwise put money in? Typically people are going to be saying it's property or shares, equities. And if you look at the ASX over the last 25 years, 9.8%-ish average annual return.
Yeah.
Australian property, about 6.8%. Now, if you took $100,000, or let's say $125,000, I'll factor in stamp duty, closing costs, and you bought the ASX 200 25 years ago, the numbers that you would have today is about $1.3 million in total assets if you reinvested the profit and it just kept compounding.
Yeah.
If you took that $125,000 and bought a $500,000 asset, or let's say two assets equating to $500,000, and you got that 6.8% return, that same time, same patience, exactly $500,000 in assets. And this comes back down to one of those things we'll discuss, which is the power of leverage, is that turns into essentially $2.6 million in exactly the same period of time with at 6.8% return. So lesser return, but the leverage and the compounding. So what is a $1.2-ish million gain after you factor in your original investment in the ASX turns into a $2 million gain in property in Australia for the exact same period of time. And what that property can't do is it can't turn to zero. Well, it hasn't yet turned to zero. And
yeah, some stocks can.
Some stocks can.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, anyone who's listening to this and has had a dabble, not only in stocks, but maybe in crypto over the last 3, 4, 5 years, in stocks over the last 25 years, I've personally owned owned stock that has turned to zero.
Yeah.
I'm yet to own a property or invest in close to 3,500 properties in the last 8 years that has turned anything close to those numbers.
Yeah, and that's magical things. So, I think, and I'm sure there's plenty of stock people listening to this going, property stuffed, and stock's the way to go.
Yeah.
But those numbers you're talking about there, I think, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but you would have needed to have been in the market on, I can't remember, 3 or 4 distinct moments in time to actually get that
9.8%.
But there's a couple of inflection points. If you went in the market on that day, nothing.
Yeah.
If you sold it the day before, you got it the day after.
The GFC's got that.
All that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So it's really about timing. It's a lot more forgivable timing in property, right? They always say it's time in the market rather than timing the market.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not going to be a property v shares sort of thing. I've got
chance.
I've got shares.
So do I.
My share portfolio.
I'm happy to show you mine.
I keep trying.
It's a sea of red today. I know that much.
I keep trying. But there's missed opportunity costs. I said, imagine if I just put that money in. Wish I had that cash right now.
Absolutely.
I'd do something with it. But so you started the business, and did that stop you from investing for a little while? Because I know banks get a bit sort of jittery if you need a couple of years of financials, right? Did that stifle your property investing during that period?
It certainly made me think about it prior to, and I think that's probably some of the best advice I could have got at the time of starting my business. Is I did a huge equity release, as much money as I could possibly get out of my portfolio whilst I was still a PAYG. And I got some really good people around me who I was speaking to all the time about this, and made sure I got the advice of saying, don't just start a business and think that you can keep being a property investor the next day. Essentially, the bank will turn the tap off unless, and also, for the word to the wise for any business owners, you have to show profit and you have to do it and you have to pay tax to be able to borrow money and paying tax.
You can't do both.
You can't do both.
If you try and minimise if your accountant tries to minimise your tax as much as possible, guess what? You're not going to get any borrowing from the bank.
And saving, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, $1 million in tax, for the lost borrowing capacity, if you're a property investor, start to equate what that will mean over 10 years. And that's, again, where I got some really sage advice from the same accountant I still have today. I got some sage advice from a broker who's still one of my best friends, is still a broker of a lot of my debt today, to work through the strategy there. So whilst it probably put me on the sidelines for a year, my business definitely went the right way and still is. We've got a lot of great outcomes. We worked with a lot of great clients early in the piece, which meant that our business definitely got to the point where I could use that business and the business income to then keep investing in property. So back 2015, 16, I think we continued, and every year since, I probably averaged personally probably building the portfolio with 2, 3, or 4 properties a year. But probably the biggest inflection point and change to my personal portfolio, I believe, was back in 2017. It might have been 2017, 2018. I'd have to check the dates, but I took the punt and I'd had a crack enough at a couple of subdivisions, a couple of granny flats, a few renovations, and I saw an opportunity, which was to really get a bit deeper into the Sydney market from a development standpoint. And I partnered up and also found someone who was far wiser than me, ironically an architect and a town planner. We set up a separate business, which we develop property directly within. Now, I, as a buyer's agent, am very good at sourcing, securing sites, and that's what I do in FISOs and understanding what's worth it and what's not worth it and finding out the finance structure, etc. Where my skills were needed is understanding what we could put on there, what was feasible, what the design would look like, who the end market would be, and then my job was there. So we started that, and then we bought a relatively high price asset, circa $3 million in southern Sydney. That was 1 into 4 development. which was probably a $3 million purchase, $2.5 million build. And subsequently, that was our kickstart into developing assets. So that was call it $5.5–6 million into buying, developing assets, which ended up being a gross realized value of probably circa $10–11 million over that time. So there was a very good profit in it. There's a lot of lessons learned. That was over 18–24 month period of time. But to figure out how to finance that was a challenge. To figure out the structures, to figure out how to build it, picking your builders, making sure your product was correct. And what we started then was an owner-occupier side of things, and we develop property now in a separate arm, which is not for people to invest in directly. This is what I do personally, which is geared towards buying high-end developments, typically more than just a 1 into 2 lot subdivision. It's typically more like 1 into 3, 1 into 4. And I've got a larger subdivision, which is about a 22 lot development underway up the coast at the moment. But that's led to, what was that first investment? Now we're probably pushing towards $70, $80, $90 million in developments over a 5–6 year period of time. And that's active. That's purely active. But the irony too is, Phil, and speaking about the ASX side of things and the shares, is that I've also observed, I set up my own self-managed super fund probably 5–6 years ago, had that set with a financial advisor, and it was basically just indexed into a fund, which got me whatever the market was going to get me. After a couple of years of that, I looked at it and I thought, I'm just not that enthused as the outcomes I was getting there. So I've also personally bought, even in the last couple of weeks, I've bought 2 properties, which one was a $380,000 property in Perth, another one was a $410,000 property in Perth in my super fund. I have no intention of doing anything to those properties. They're buy and hold, freestanding houses, 5, 6, 7% yield, decent blocks of land, good proximity to amenities. They're a 20-year play. And I'm going to keep buying those properties as well.
I was going to say, does it move the needle? Does it matter?
Well, this is the thing though, right? Like that money has to go somewhere. Legally, we have to pay ourselves super. Well, I can choose how much I want to put in there. But I do know that from a taxation
position. You do
position,
maximum super?
I absolutely. I believe in the super scheme, and I want to make sure that probably my intention with those properties may well be that at some stage I might go to my kids, or it might be something that's going to propel a bit more of a legacy side of things.
Well, that's
there
a good
as
thing
well.
with the super fund, right?
Correct, and it forces you to be that way, and exactly, and you can pass that on without worrying about the taxation side. But if I look at it, and I guess the reason why I highlight that is that although my investing has progressed to buy and hold, do some renovations and build this portfolio to being self-sufficient and then developing assets actively, I still believe in the lower price market and fundamentals of don't get too complicated, don't change what has worked in the past. And the super fund side of things is my opportunity to keep doing that as well. I don't probably now intend to buy those types of properties in my own name because I'm looking at more active stuff because that's where my knowledge and interest can go. But I wouldn't have even had a chance to get to this active stuff without the stuff I did 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago.
And that's the point again, people want to start investing in property. They go, oh, I want to do what Paul's doing. Well, you're on chapter 6 or 7. Yeah. Right. You're not on chapter 1.
No.
But you went through chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4 to get to the point.
And I still hold all those chapters as well.
Yeah.
So they haven't been sold.
It's people are in too much of a rush. You can't go straight into someone else's chapter 7.
No, and that's the I guess the crux of it all is that 10, 15 years of active investing. Whilst that's still a relatively short period of time in property, I've done it correctly a fair bit of the time, and I've been very lucky that a lot of the advice and a lot of property I've bought has done really well. But I'd say most of what I've done is very boring. Yeah, the vast majority.
Boring is good,
and that's why I'm very comfortable in being boring, very very comfortable. And when people talk to me about where you're buying, why you're buying there, I'm like, most of the time, and we'll unpack this with a lot of the clients that we're going to speak to as part of this podcast series, and people realise that we've bought in Hobart, Sydney, Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, Melbourne, Geelong, Frankston, Adelaide, Salisbury, Perth, you name it, Canberra, and I could keep rattling off each one of these either major metro or major regional markets. We've bought in them, sometimes dozens of times, sometimes in different cycles. But the intention here is to say that we're not buying in one market. There is no secret sauce. We're buying, we're holding, we're managing cash flow, and we're replicating.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you like working with people who are happy with the process, the boring.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm very happy working with people who really realise that probably vast majority of people's time is better spent doing whatever else they do.
Yeah.
Whether it's running a business, whether it's PAYG, whether it's starting a career, whether it's going into retirement and essentially wanting to enjoy their retirement, whether it's essentially having all of these things, but also prioritising, hey, I want to spend my time with my family as opposed to trudging the pavement on the weekends or getting on a plane and trying to figure out a suburb. Our job is really to say, if you can be comfortable knowing enough to know why you're doing it, but essentially outsourcing the rest from that point to say, I understand why and understand what. Your job is to do the doing. Our job is to really, ideally, they're our perfect client because they know, they trust the process. They're not trying to make money next year. They're trying to make money over a 10, 15, 20-year period. But we want to get it all set up correct. The pre-game, as you said, the game is our job. The post-game is where we work back together and then figure out again what the pre-game is for the next purchase, execute on the game, go back to post-game. What do we do differently? Where are we? Are we at the grand final? Is that it? Do we retire? All those things.
So that'll give us a construct to this podcast. It's also a good construct for how you work with clients. I'll conclude with this question because I'm conscious of time. What are the best pre-game property investors doing?
I think if I'm realistic on that, they typically they've done a bit of reading, but they haven't sat around for 2 or 3, 4, 5 years and thought, I knew what I wanted to do that, and I just haven't done anything because I just got paralysis out of the whole scenario. They're typically not those people. I mean, eventually, I love working with those common people because they typically sit on their heels and wait, or sit on their hands rather than wait, and they think, oh, I should have done it. All right, I've just got to outsource it because I know I'm just going to get the yips every time. But the people I know and the people I've worked with over a decade period of time who I know have achieved amazing things with nothing amazing as far as their starting point, is they typically are comfortable to be open to asking the question, what do I need to do? And then taking advice. Now, the what do I need to do usually comes, hypothetically, you have your own home, you have a bit of equity, you know there's enough in there to get moving, and you might have done your own online calculators to say, I could probably borrow X comfortably. If they came to us with that type of position, we are able to do so much with that. And not only short-term to just buy an asset, it's also plan out, what does the short-term look like? What does the mid-term look like? The 1 to 3, 1 to 5 years. What does that end up being resulting in over the long term? And then from there, we're not straight into buying a property necessarily. We'll set the strategy, set the criteria. But what we want to do is build that team of who's the dream team, who are the key fundamental players that you build the rest of the team around. And going back to sporting analogies, if you're talking about footy, you're typically talking a halfback, a 5'8", a fullback. If you're talking, AFL, you're talking your midfielders, you're talking about a couple of different leaders in between that. You're talking netball, you're typically talking your centres. If you're talking cricket, you're talking your all-rounders.
What's that person in volleyball that does all the setting?
The libero.
Is it libero?
There you go.
It's libero, right? Normally the shortest player just
shortest player, wears a different shirt, typically never spiking, but very, very jammy and quite clever. And every sport and every business and everyone who someone works for a company, there is a libero, but there's also, and again, that's the thing, is we want to build this small nucleus, and then once we've got those, and sometimes that only takes one conversation to build that team. It doesn't mean that we have to go off and then wait 2 or 3, 4, 5 months to build this up. Most of the time we can advise as to who these people need to be. And I'm not doing it from a standpoint of saying they need to be our team. We've got people, we can send off recommendations, or we can say, look, here's who you need. You might already have someone. We don't want to change that. So we're not here to change what is already working. Once we've got that, we go and buy. Once you buy, then you typically need to add on those other players. And those other players is part of what we do, is conveyancers, building and pest inspectors, your property managers, your insurance depreciation schedules. We try to make sure we arrange that secondary team to be available at the time that they need to be available. And that's a big part of our job as well.
And to get back to sport analogies, property investment's a team sport, right?
100%. The best people, and Phil, I'm sure you could attest to this, mate. If I ask you a particular question about certain assets of yours, you'd say, look, speak to that person. They handle this. That's not for me to know. I know why I'm doing it and probably what I own. Beyond that, I'm probably not going to be the person who's closest to the detail. Yep.
Good. Well, this is episode 1 of the Pure Property Podcast with Paul Glossop. It's good to catch up.
Yeah, mate.
I think we're onto something here. It's good. Pre-game, game, post-game. So you're going to bring someone in next time.
I am.
Have a bit of a chat around how they play the game, and then we can sort of pull it apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first guest I'm going to get on is probably ideally going to be someone who's been in the game for quite some time and not on a outrageous salary or started a hugely successful business. normal salary, normal incomes, had an aspiration to get to a position where they wanted to exit the workforce and had a starting point with some equity available, built a very successful portfolio over a 6, 7, 8 year period, and has essentially got to the point where they wanted to get to. So we can walk through warts and all what they've done. There's a couple of things they probably would have done different, a couple of things that they would do more of if they had a chance again. But the secret to that is that they've probably held almost all of those assets, some for 5 years, some for 15 years.
It's the way to go. Mm-hmm. It's good. Nice one. In the interim, people want to speak to you on your team. Are you free and available to chat to
purepropertyinvestment.com. On all the socials, pure_property on Instagram, on Facebook, LinkedIn. They can't miss us. If you look for us and you want to speak to us, if you jump onto purepropertyinvestment.com, there's an Inquire Now button front and center, and you can lock in some time in my calendar. Typically,
so they get to speak to you if they like
speak directly with me, and you can see my calendar. You will be able to access it within 2 clicks. Click 1. Open the web page, click 2, open Inquire Now, and then by the time you've done that, you'll probably be able to lock in a time to speak with me within sometimes a couple of days, sometimes maximum a week.
Mm. And how prepared do you need to be able to talk to you effectively?
Like I said too, mate, I think as long as someone has some sort of understanding as to where they are, and when I say an understanding, I don't need to understand their bank statements or go through 3 months of their profit and loss or their entire expenditure. If they know where they are, typically if they've got circa $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 starting point, whether it's cash, equity, a guarantor, opportunity from folks or someone else, that's all we need to understand. I can typically model a lot about where their current borrowing capacity is. So they don't need to speak to a broker before they speak to us. They don't need to speak to a solicitor. They don't need to set up some fancy trust structure. They just need to understand that they are prepared to probably get moving and start to do something. Our job is to really model out where they could be if they started now and where they might have missed out if they don't start.
Okay. The Pure Property Podcast with Paul Glossop, episode 1. I've enjoyed that. We'll be back again next time. Until then, bye-bye.